There are two kinds of people in a crisis. The first kind gets swept away. The emotion hits the fear, the anger, the panic, the grief, and it takes over. It dictates what they say, what they do, the decisions they make at the worst possible time. And they live with the consequences long after the crisis has passed. The second kind does something different. The same emotion hits, maybe even harder. Maybe they're feeling more than the person who got swept away, but they don't disappear into it. They stay, they move through it. They make the call that needs to be made, have the conversation that can't be avoided, hold the space that someone else needs while carrying everything they're carrying. And when it's over, they're still standing. You've seen both kinds of people. You already know which one you want to be. The question is, what's the actual difference between them? Because it's not what most people think. It's not that the second person feels less. It's not that they're wired differently. It's not that they had an easier life, fewer hard things, less to carry. The difference is something that was built, deliberately, over time, through understanding something about emotions that most people never learn. And that's what this is about. Here's the first thing you need to understand, and this alone will shift how you see yourself. Emotional strength is not the absence of emotion. Read that again. Not the absence. The person who never seems rattled, who stays steady in situations that break other people, who carries enormous difficulty without collapsing, that person is not feeling less than you. In many cases, they're feeling more. The difference is not volume. The difference is in the relationship. The emotionally strong person has a different relationship with what they feel. They don't treat every emotion as an emergency. They don't treat every difficult feeling as a verdict on their situation or themselves. They don't conflate feeling something with being controlled by it. They have learned through practice, through failure, through deliberate effort, that a feeling is information, not instruction, not command, not truth about the world. Information. And information, unlike command, can be received, understood, and then responded to thoughtfully. That shift from emotion as command to emotion as information is the foundation of everything in this script. Because once you stop treating your emotions as things that happen to you and start treating them as things that happen inside you, as signals from your own system about what matters, what's at risk, what needs attention, you stop being their passenger, and you start having a say in what happens next. But here's what you're missing about emotions, and this is where it gets really important. Your emotions are not random. They are not arbitrary eruptions from some unpredictable internal volcano. Every emotion you feel has a cause, a specific trigger, a belief it's attached to, a need it's pointing toward. The anxiety isn't just anxiety. It's anxiety about something specific, usually about a loss of control, a threat to something you care about, an uncertainty your mind is struggling to tolerate. The anger isn't just anger. It's anger about something specific, usually about a boundary that was crossed, a value that was violated, a need that went unacknowledged. The sadness isn't just sadness. It's sadness about something specific, a loss, an ending, a gap between what you hoped for and what is. Every emotion is a sentence. Most people only hear the volume. The emotionally strong person has learned to read the words. And when you can read the words, when you can hear what the emotion is actually saying, rather than just experiencing its intensity, something changes. It stops feeling like a storm you're trapped in, and it starts feeling like a message you can understand. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because this next part is the one most people avoid. Most people struggle with emotional control, who feel like their emotions run them, rather than the other way around, are not dealing with a discipline problem. They are dealing with a processing problem. Emotions that aren't processed don't go away. This is not a metaphor. This is how the nervous system actually works. When a strong emotion arrives and is suppressed, pushed down, covered over, held back with the effort of will and performance and functioning, it doesn't dissolve. It stores in the body, in the nervous system, in the tightness you've learned to carry in your shoulders, your chest, your jaw, in the overreaction that arrives 6 months later over something small and confuses everyone in the room, including you. You've experienced this. You've had a reaction that was bigger than the moment warranted. And afterward, in the quiet, you recognized that wasn't really about this. That was about everything that wasn't allowed to be about anything for a long time. This is what unprocessed emotion looks like from the outside. It compresses. It accumulates. And then it expresses, usually sideways, usually at the wrong target, usually at the worst time. So emotional strength is not about holding more in. It is about building the capacity to process rather than suppress, to feel what needs to be felt when it needs to be felt, in a way that releases it rather than stores it, to let the emotion move through you, which is quite literally what emotion means. Energy in motion. The emotionally strong person doesn't feel less. They process faster. They let things move rather than holding them still. And the capacity to do that, to let an emotion arrive, be received and pass through, is a capacity that can be built. Starting now. Now, here's the part nobody talks about, honestly, and it might be the most important piece in this entire script. The thing that makes emotions feel uncontrollable, the thing that turns a manageable feeling into an overwhelming one, is almost never the emotion itself. It's the story attached to it. Here's what this means. Something happens, a difficult thing, and before you've even consciously processed what happened, before you've decided what you think or feel about it, your mind has already written a story about it. And the story is almost always worse than the event, because the story doesn't just describe what happened. It assigns meaning. It draws conclusions. It connects this moment to every previous moment that felt like this. It projects forward into every future moment that might feel like this. It decides what this says about you, about others, about the world. And then the emotion you feel is not just about the event. It's about the story the event triggered. The email that came in with critical feedback. The event, someone has feedback about your work. The story, I'm not good enough. They're questioning my competence. This is going to affect how people see me. I should never have put myself out there. I knew this would happen. The event is manageable. The story is overwhelming. And this is why the same objective situation can completely devastate one person and barely register for another. They're not experiencing the same event. They're experiencing entirely different stories about the same event. The emotionally strong person is not better at tolerating difficult events. They're better at catching the story before it runs, better at asking what is actually happening here right now, in reality, versus what am I adding to it. And that question, asked genuinely, in the gap between the event and the response, changes everything. But here's what you're missing about this gap. Most people don't know the gap exists because the story arrives so fast, attached to the event so automatically that the event and the story feel like the same thing. They feel simultaneous, indistinguishable. Like the emotional response is just a natural, unavoidable, objective response to what happened. It isn't. Between what happens and what you feel about it, there is a gap. It's narrow. Sometimes it's milliseconds. But it's there. And in that gap lives something that most people never access. Choice. Not the choice to not feel. Not the choice to suppress or perform or pretend. The choice of what to do with what you feel, how to interpret it, what story to attach to it, whether that story is accurate or whether it's the old pattern running an automatic script over a situation that deserves fresh eyes, widening that gap, learning to find it. then slow it, then consciously inhabit it, is the core practice of emotional strength. And it is a practice, not a decision you make once and own forever. A practice you return to, imperfectly, repeatedly, in the small moments and the large ones, until the gap that started at milliseconds becomes seconds, and seconds become enough. Let's talk about what emotional strength actually looks like from the inside, because there's a version of it that most people chase, and it's the wrong version. The wrong version looks like stone, unfeeling, unmoved, above it all, detached from the mess and difficulty of actual human experience. You've seen this version. Maybe you've even admired it. The person who never cries, never shows vulnerability, never admits difficulty, who moves through the hardest things as if they're made of something different from the rest of us. Here's the truth about that version. That is not a strength. That is armor. And armor has a cost. The person in armor is not strong. They are protected. And protection and strength are not the same thing. Protection says, if I don't feel this, it can't hurt me. Strength says, I can feel this fully and still move through it. Protection closes. Strength opens and holds. The person in armor doesn't experience less pain. They experience deferred pain. Pain that went unacknowledged and unprocessed, that compressed somewhere quiet and keeps affecting everything while appearing to affect nothing. The relationships that never quite go deep enough. The moments of genuine joy that can't fully land because the same wall that keeps the pain out keeps everything else out too. The exhaustion of maintaining a front that has to be held up constantly because the moment it drops, everything that's been stored behind it might finally come through. That is not the emotional strength we're building here. The emotional strength we're building is something harder to achieve and infinitely more sustainable. The ability to feel everything and let it move through you and still be standing. Here's what you're missing about why some emotions feel impossible to control. It's not the emotion that's out of control. It's the nervous system. And your nervous system is not under your direct command, but it is under your indirect influence. Here's what this means. Your nervous system has two primary states. One is activation, the state of alert, of readiness, of mobilizing for threat or challenge. Heart rate up, breathing shallower, muscles prepared, attention narrowed. The other is regulation, the state of rest, of recovery, of openness, heart rate lower, breathing deeper, muscles releasing, attention expanding. When you're in activation, and most people who struggle with emotional control are in it far more than they realize, often as a chronic baseline, the threshold for reactive emotion drops. Things that would be manageable in a regulated state become genuinely overwhelming. Frustrations that would pass become crises. Hurts that would sting for a moment become evidence of something catastrophic. You're not a different person when this happens. You're a regulated person with a temporarily dysregulated nervous system. And the gap between those two states is enormous. This is why emotional control strategies fail at the worst moments, because the worst moments are exactly when the nervous system is most activated. And in that activated state, the strategies that work fine in theory become almost inaccessible in practice. The intervention that actually works is not the strategy applied at the moment of crisis. It is the daily maintenance of nervous system regulation that makes the crisis less of a crisis. So what does that daily maintenance look like? Not as a wellness trend, as a serious, non-negotiable foundation for emotional strength. Sleep is the most significant factor in emotional regulation most people consistently underestimate. One night of poor sleep measurably increases amygdala reactivity. The brain's threat detection system fires more easily, more intensely, at lower thresholds. The same situation that you handle with equilibrium on 8 hours of sleep can feel genuinely destabilizing on 5. This is not a personality difference. This is chemistry. The person who snaps at something small and then wonders why they overreacted was probably running on insufficient sleep, in a state of chronic low-level activation, with a depleted prefrontal cortex that couldn't intercept the reaction before it fired. That's a maintenance problem, not a character problem. Movement matters for the same reason. Physical movement metabolizes the stress chemistry that builds up in the body. Cortisol, adrenaline. The hormones of activation are meant to be burned through physical action. When they aren't, they sit in the body, keeping the system elevated, lowering the threshold for reactive emotion. Movement is not just exercise, it is direct nervous system regulation. As concrete and reliable as any emotional strategy, and silence matters not. The silence of suppression, but the silence of genuine stillness. The mind that is always taking in input, always receiving, always reacting, always processing something, has no space for the natural recovery that happens when nothing is coming in. Regular stretches of genuine quiet, no podcast, no music, no scroll, give the nervous system the conditions it needs to return to baseline. These are not soft suggestions. These are the infrastructure on which everything else is built. Without them, emotional control is a constant upstream battle. With them, the baseline shifts and the battle stops being constant. Now let's go somewhere deeper, because here's what most emotional strength content never addresses directly. The emotions that are hardest to control are almost always the ones attached to the things you care about most. You already know this. You've seen it in yourself. You can be completely unrattled by situations that would upset someone else, and completely devastated by something that would barely register for them. The difference is not sensitivity. The difference is investment. The things you care about deeply are the things that have the most power over your emotional state. And that's not a weakness. That's love. That's commitment. That's what it feels like to have something worth protecting. But it also means that emotional strength in those areas and the relationships that matter most, the work that means most, the dreams that carry the most weight is harder to maintain. Because the stakes feel real, because they are real. And this is where the work gets personal in a way that generic advice about emotional control completely misses. The question is not, how do I feel less about the things I love? That question leads to the wrong answer, to armor, to distance, to the kind of protection that keeps pain out and keeps life out in equal measure. The real question is, how do I feel deeply about the things I love without being destabilized by every fluctuation in their condition? How do I care fully without my inner state being completely at the mercy of the outcome? And the answer to that question lives in something called non-attachment. Not detachment, non-attachment. Here's where it gets uncomfortable because this concept gets misunderstood almost every time it comes up. Non-attachment does not mean not caring. It means not requiring a specific outcome in order to be okay. Here's the difference. Attachment says, if this goes well, I'm okay. If it doesn't, I'm not. Non-attachment says, I want this deeply. I'm working toward it fully. And my fundamental well-being is not riding on whether I get it. Attachment makes every setback a crisis. Non-attachment allows you to be genuinely disappointed, clean, real disappointment, without being destabilized. Attachment makes every uncertainty unbearable. Non-attachment allows you to sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. Attachment means other people's behavior determines your inner state. Non-attachment means you have an inner state that can be affected by others, moved, hurt, even deeply so, but not dismantled by them. This is not a cold position. It is not a way of loving less. It is a way of loving from a more stable place. of being fully present in the relationship, the work, the dream without making it the sole structural support of your entire inner architecture. The person who has everything riding on one outcome is not more committed than the person who doesn't. They're more fragile. And fragility is not a form of love. Stability is. Let's talk about the hardest emotional situation, not the big crisis, the person. The one specific person in your life who can get to you like no one else can. Maybe it's someone you love deeply. Maybe it's someone who has hurt you. Maybe it's both. But there's someone who bypasses everything, every strategy, every understanding, every version of yourself that stays steady in other situations and lands directly on the most tender, most reactive, most difficult part of you. You've tried to change how you respond to them. You've had the clarity in calm moments about what you want to do differently. And then they do the thing or say the thing. And the understanding goes somewhere, and what's left is just the feeling. Here's what you need to understand about why that happens. That person is not triggering your emotions. They are triggering your history. Specifically the places in your history where something similar happened and left something unresolved. Where a wound formed that never fully closed. Where the nervous system made a file about what this kind of interaction means and has been running that file ever since. The current person is new. The file is old. And the old file is what's producing the reaction. This is why you can understand a situation completely, can know logically that it's not as serious as it feels and still feel the full intensity of the reaction. Because the reaction is not responding to what you understand. It's responding to what you carry, and what you carry is older and more deeply grooved than any amount of intellectual understanding can simply override. But here's what changes this. When you can, in the moment, or close to it, recognize that the intensity of what you're feeling is bigger than this situation alone, something shifts. Not a dramatic shift, not an immediate exit from the feeling. A small, important shift from, this person is doing this to me, to, this situation is touching something old in me. That shift does not eliminate the feeling, but it changes who is responsible for it. And when the responsibility moves even slightly from outside you to inside you, the feeling stops being something that's happening to you and starts being something you can work with. Here's something you need to hear about emotional strength that the highlights never include. You will fail at this repeatedly. You will have the understanding. You will have the practice. You will know what you're supposed to do in the moment, and the moment will arrive, and you won't do it. You'll say the thing you wanted to stay quiet about. You'll break down when you were trying to hold together. You'll let an emotion run its full course through a situation that deserved something more measured, and afterward you'll feel two things, the original feeling, which has passed, and the shame of having not handled it better. And here's the part that determines whether you grow from it or stay exactly where you are. What you do with the shame. Shame says, I failed. I always fail at this. This is who I am. And that story, if you accept it, becomes the evidence for the next failure. The alternative is not to dismiss the failure, not to tell yourself it didn't matter. It happened. It cost something. That's real. The alternative is forensics instead of verdict. What specifically happened? Where was I in my nervous system before it arrived? What was the trigger, the actual trigger, not just the surface one? What was the story I attached to it? Where was the gap, and what made it smaller than usual? What would I do differently, knowing what I know now? Those questions are not comfortable, but they are productive, and productivity in the face of failure is what separates the person who grows from the person who stays. Every failed moment of emotional control is a detailed map of your specific pattern. The conditions that deplete you, the triggers that bypass everything. the stories that run fastest, the situations where the gap is narrowest. That map, read honestly, is the most specific and useful piece of information available for actually changing the pattern. You can't read it if you're in the shame. You can only read it from the outside. Get to the outside, and then read the map. Here's the thing about emotionally strong people that never makes it into the highlights version of this topic. They are not unaffected. They grieve. They get scared. They feel the loneliness. They carry the weight of difficult things without it looking like weight from the outside. The difference, the one that looks like immunity from the outside, is not what they feel. It's what they do with space and time. The emotionally strong person has developed the capacity to hold a feeling without immediately having to act on it. To be in grief without demanding that the grief resolve on a schedule. To be afraid without letting the fear make decisions. To be angry without the anger determining what they say. This capacity to hold an emotion without being driven by it is not natural. Not for most people. Not in a culture that treats feelings as either things to act on immediately or things to suppress entirely. The middle path: feel it fully, hold it, let it inform you, and then choose your response deliberately, is something that has to be learned, practiced, earned, and it is available to every person willing to do the work, including you. Now let's talk about the dimension of emotional strength that almost nobody covers. And it's the one that in some ways makes everything else possible. Self-compassion, not self-indulgence, not making excuses, not bypassing accountability. Genuine, honest compassion for yourself as a human being navigating genuinely difficult things. Here's why this matters for emotional strength specifically. The person who is harsh with themselves when they struggle emotionally, who treats every reactive moment as a moral failure, who maintains a running internal commentary of criticism about their own emotional responses, is running a significant energetic drain that most people never account for. The self-criticism consumes resources, cognitive resources, emotional resources. The same resources needed for the next moment of genuine emotional regulation. And the cruelest thing about self-criticism as a strategy for emotional improvement is this: it produces more of what it's criticizing. The nervous system that is chronically under self-attack is chronically in a state of low-level activation, which is exactly the state in which emotional control is hardest. Self-compassion does the opposite, not by removing accountability, but by shifting the energy from condemnation, which depletes, to understanding, which restores. The person who responds to their own emotional difficulty with, "Of course this is hard. Of course this person's behavior affects me. Of course I'm not perfect at this," and then continues working, has more capacity available than the person who responds with, "Why can't I just be better at this?" You cannot be compassionate toward others beyond your own capacity for self-compassion. The steadiness you want to offer in the hard moments of someone else's life requires a foundation of steadiness with your own. Build that foundation, not as an afterthought, as infrastructure. Here's the last layer, the one underneath everything we've covered. And it's the most personal piece. Emotional strength. Real emotional strength, not the armor version, requires knowing what you actually value, not what you're supposed to value, not what the version of you performing competence in public claims to value, what you actually genuinely care about. Because emotional strength isn't about becoming indifferent to everything. It's about becoming clear about what deserves your emotional energy and what doesn't, and that clarity, the ability to distinguish between the things that matter and the things that only feel like they matter, is one of the most powerful forms of emotional control available. The person who reacts to everything is not more passionate than the person who doesn't. They're less discerning. Every frustration is not worth the cost of losing your regulation over it. Every criticism is not worth the energy of full defensive activation. Every uncertainty is not worth the 3 days of anxious rehearsal. The person who knows what genuinely matters, who has done the honest work of figuring out where their actual values live, can let a lot of things go. Not because they're suppressing, because they've made a genuine assessment and decided this is not worth that. This is not dismissiveness. This is emotional economy. The energy you spend being reactive to things that don't actually matter is energy stolen from the things that do. And the things that do, the relationships, the work, the values, the life you're actually trying to build, deserve everything you've been leaking on things that never warranted it. Here's where we leave this. Not with a list, not with a technique, with a truth that takes time to fully land. Emotional strength is not something you achieve. It's something you practice every day, in the small moments and the large ones, in the situations where it's easy and the situations where everything in you wants to react. It's the practice of finding the gap, of reading the emotion instead of obeying it, of catching the story before it catches you, of processing instead of suppressing, of holding instead of exploding or collapsing, of being fully in what you feel without being owned by it. And it builds, not dramatically, not with a single turning point where everything became different. Slowly, cumulatively, in the accumulation of moments where you were steady when you didn't have to be, where you paused when every instinct said react, where you felt the full weight of something difficult and didn't try to make it smaller or put it somewhere else, where you held it. That holding, that capacity to be with what is hard without being broken by it, is emotional strength. Not the absence of difficulty, not the absence of feeling, the presence of something inside you that is larger than either, something that was not given to you, something you built. One practiced moment at a time. You've already started. The fact that you're here, that you're asking this question, that you're willing to go deeper than the surface version of this, means the work has already begun. What remains is to continue it, imperfectly, persistently, with more compassion for yourself than you've probably been allowing, and with the growing understanding that emotional strength is not the goal at the end of the road, it is the road. And every single step on it matters.